From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. My name is John Van Oudenaarde. I'm the Director of Scholarly and Educational Programs here at the Library of Congress. I met some of you the other evening when you were just arriving. For some those of you who are from the Rare Book School, I did meet some of you, and others of you I haven't met. I'm here to introduce our distinguished speaker. Michael F. Suarez S.J. has served as Director of the Rare Book School, Professor of English, University Professor, and Honorary Curator of Special Collections at the University of Virginia since 2009. He has many degrees. I actually had to have a little tutorial out in the hallway about how to say some of these degrees, but he received a D.Phil, a Master of Studies, and an M.A.B.A. from Oxford University, a Master of Theology and a Master of Divinity from the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and a B.A. from Bucknell University. He has written widely on various aspects of 18th century English literature, bibliography, and book history, and he has held research fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Folger Shakespeare Library. He is a CLIR, that's Council of Library and Information Resources, CLIR. He is a CLIR Distinguished Presidential Fellow, a member of the Advisory Board of the Library of Congress Literacy Awards Program, the Council of the Bibliographical Society of America, and the Board of Managers of the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale University. So he comes with great credentials and an enormous amount of experience and knowledge. Since 2010, he has served as Editor-in-Chief of Oxford Scholarly Editions Online. His recent books include The Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, Volume 5, 1695 to 1830, obviously published by Cambridge University Press, which is co-edited with Michael Turner, and The Oxford Companion to the Book, published by Oxford University Press, a million-word reference book co-edited with H.R. Woodhausen. The book, A Global History, also co-edited with H.R. Woodhausen, first appeared in 2013. In 2014, Oxford University Press published his edition of The Dublin Notebook, co-edited with Leslie Higgins in the collected works of Gerard Manley Hopkins. He delivered the 2015 Lyell Lectures in Bibliography at the University of Oxford. So with that introduction, Father Suarez, we look forward to hearing you talk about the business of abridgments in 18th century Britain and America. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We probably don't need the waiver on the podium. I know the federal government is interested in the legalities, but we probably put that to the side. So today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the world of abridgments, and indeed I'd like to establish with you the ubiquity of abridgments in the 18th century. I think it's not too much to say that the reprint trade in the 18th century is the trade in abridgments, and I'll explain why as we continue on. So first I'd like to begin with a small post-octavo that you see on your screens. This is Ortelius, his great atlas done in octavo. This is 1601, and by no means the first of these abridgments. There's an antecedent abridgment in 1577, and I adduce this because the abridgment isn't invented in the 18th century. That would be fatuous to think so. But the rhetoric of the abridgment is very much part and parcel here of what it'll be in our own century. Somehow this is smaller, more portable, more useful. That's how it's being marketed. And there's always a rhetoric of value added. So in this case, there's a star map and 2 other maps added, one of Formosa, that aren't in the original. And so the idea is get this and you'll be able to have things that you wouldn't be able to get in the full big trophy atlas. It's also true that many of you will know from studying Ortelius that that book was seldom used. It's a gentleman's trophy book in many ways, whereas if you, as I have, make a comprehensive study as best you can of the surviving abridgments from 77 and 01, these post-octavos show many more signs of actual use. Many of you will know the story told by Daniel Defoe, who went holed up for 5 years while writing his great poetic treatise on the divine right of kings, Jure Divino, a book in 375 pages folio. A book that cost, without the frontispiece, the whopping sum in 1706 of 10 shillings, and with the frontispiece, in which Defoe is, as you can see, big-wigged, it's 13 shillings, okay? This is Defoe wanting to become the next John Dryden, okay? He fails. And on the day that the folio was published, the very same day, Defoe discovers he was betrayed by someone in his own printer's printing office, and exactly concomitantly, the down market version in octavo of this book comes out, selling not for 13 with the frontispiece, not for 10 without the frontispiece, but for 5 shillings. Defoe himself says, I lost 1,500 pounds because of the piracy, and people often think, because they know the octavo, it survives in large numbers, that it's because of the publication of this octavo. This, ladies and gentlemen, is by no means the case. The octavo hurt him, he had to lower his price, but the real couplet are the halfpenny and penny abridgments. And this is an example of one of those. You can see the incredible page depth, the number of lines per page here. You can see how closely printed it is. And the idea is that there's one either full sheet or half sheet number for each of the 12 books. These are very rare now because they were little pamphlets. They're very hard to find in any concentrated numbers to study bibliographically. But let's look what the advertisements say. You can get the 12 books of Jure Divino, which had been 13 shillings and then came down to 5 because he had to compete with the octavo. Thank you very much. You can get it now in halfpenny parts on the left or in penny parts on the right, depending upon if it's a half sheet or a whole sheet. So you can get the whole of Jure Divino, not for 13 shillings, not for 10 shillings, not for 5 shillings, but for 12 pence or 6 pence. Well, it's not the whole, it's the epitome. Yeah, it's the abridgment. And this is the attitude that I had toward abridgments. This is what I knew abridgments were. I had made a study of Defoe, and I knew about Hills, the Blackfriars pirate, and what he had done. And this is exactly what an abridgment was in the 18th century. I felt certain. But I decided to inquire a little bit further. And I read the work of a man named Jordan Howell in the library, an article I recommend to you most strongly. And Mr. Howell, for his doctoral dissertation, made a study of the abridgments of Robinson Crusoe. And here's what he discovered. 75% of the Robinson Crusoe titles published in the 18th century are abridgments. 75% of the titles are abridgments. That's a breathtaking thing. And as we'll see, Crusoe abridgments appear in a disproportionate way. Now, this is partly because we know Robinson Crusoe as one book, whereas Robinson Crusoe is really 3 books, okay? First, there's the story of Robinson Crusoe that we know. Then there's the strange and surprising adventures. And finally, there's serious reflection on the life and history of Robinson Crusoe. And so these volumes together make up a 3-volume set. And this is very long. And I can tell you the 3rd volume in particular, kind of boring. Lots of reflections on particular providence, not many things moving very quickly. And so this gets abridged and abridged and abridged. Well, very well. None of these abridgments were authorized. And again, I thought this must be akin to what happened to Defoe with Jure Divino. And then I started to look still more closely into the world of abridgments, and I saw that one John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, who didn't seem like very much of a rapscallion to me, certainly not akin to Hills, the Blackfriars Pirate, I saw that in 48 he abridged Pilgrim's Progress, and that one by 66 is in a 5th edition. And I thought, oh, very well, he does this because he has a religious purpose and they leave him alone, because obviously this must be actionable. And then I went in and I saw some more Wesley books and I was astonished. The Manners of the Ancient Christians is in a 5th edition. It's an abridgment. Nicodemus, a treatise on the fear of man. The Life of God and the Soul of Man. And you can see at the bottom one of the keys to Wesley's success, printed and sold at the New Chapel City Road and at the Reverend Mr. Wesley's preaching houses in town and country. And here we see a distribution network. And on further inquiry with the help of the ESTC and a little digging, I discover that John Wesley is the greatest abridger in the history of the 18th century, and that he's responsible for more than 100 titles being abridged. About 600 editions in all. And I thought to myself, gosh, I wonder if Wesley was ever taken to court for any of these, because he doesn't seem like a man who would willfully break the law. And I found out that the only time he ever ran into any trouble at all was when in one of his volumes he reprinted parts of Night Thoughts, which was in the copyright of Robert Dodsley, and Dodsley came to him and said, that's mine, thank you very much. And they settled the matter completely out of court. Wesley gave him £20 and promised not to do it again. And that seemed to be okay for everybody. But searching the records of the law courts in England, Wesley is never, numquam, ever brought to court for any of these abridgments. We'll soon see why. So let's pause for a moment here and try to understand why abridgments are so ubiquitous in the 18th century. For the most part, a pamphlet costs between 6p and 18p, and you can see the newspapers are about 3p. Novels unsewn are 2 and 6, or 3 shillings if they're in trade bindings, and octavos are about 5 shillings a volume. This is a lot of money. And books are luxury commodities throughout the century. And unless we understand that, we won't really understand the world of abridgments, although there's a lot more to say. A little consumer price index information to try to help you out so you understand, well, how much is 5 shillings? How much is 3 shillings? And you could say that, see that a bushel of coal is 14p. A pound of wheat is 1 3/4 pence. Okay, an annual rent for a laborer, £1, 8 shillings and twopence, and with the cost of all his utilities, as it were, his heating, it's about £3 per annum. Yeah, £2.5 per annum. So when we start to think about what books cost, we see that books are indeed luxury commodities. There's more to be told still, however. So Samuel Johnson himself in Rambler 145 tells us that some readers delight in abstracts and epitomes, and I think other than money, the most powerful resource that people have is time. And so we shouldn't just imagine that the only people who are reading abridgments are people who are too poor to buy the full thing, because maybe you just want to get the gist of it and move on. Maybe you just want to be able to say, sure, I read that. Right? So this is kind of interesting. So when we think about why abridgments are, on the one hand, everywhere, and on the other hand, have been bibliographically invisible to us, I think that we need to think about two things. The first of these is the cultures of collecting. Do you really think that with the formation of the principal cultural institutions of England and America in the 19th century, that those institutions were collecting the piracies of Robinson Crusoe? Do you really think that they were collecting the abridgments of Locke and Hume? Why would they? They're not the real thing. They're not the first editions. Haven't received any bibliographical treatment. There are no points. And so you can imagine that the culture of collecting in the 19th century, right through the 20th century, is one in which the abridgment is pretty much invisible. That's the first thing. The second thing to bear in mind is survival rates, ladies and gentlemen. It is true that survival rates are not entirely stochastic processes. Sure, sometimes there's a flood, sometimes there's a fire, and whatever's in its wake is going to be destroyed. But it's also true that smaller books have a lower survival rate. Unbound books have a much lower survival rate. The unbound book does not survive is a good rule of thumb. If you're buying the small abridgment, is that not rather akin to buying the paperback? So then why would you bother to pay to have it bound, right? But we also need to remember Roger Stoddard's law, which goes like this. Roger Stoddard, the brilliant bibliographer and curator at Harvard University for so many years, informs us rightly, bigger books linger longer, little books last least. Well, these abridgments are little books perforce, both in their formats, duodecimos and 16mos, some of them even 32mos, but they're also little books in the sense that they have low sheet counts, right? So these are the books that are likely to last the least. The cultures of collecting determine that they're not important, they're not the real McCoy, and they're going to be unbound, they're not sold in trade bindings, and they're little books that are very likely to last least. So the survival rates are extremely low. And yet we know Samuel Johnson was an abridger, Tobias Smollett was an abridger, Oliver Goldsmith was an abridger. You get the idea, right? There are a lot of people who we regard as pretty high-end authors who are employed by the booksellers to do the business of creating these abridgments, in part because over time their names carry with them a kind of authorizing cultural capital. So this is a very preliminary bibliometric analysis of the English short title catalog. And you can see, ladies and gentlemen, for this, all I did was look at titles that announce themselves as abridgments or epitomes. So there are no silent abridgments in this count at all, and there are many other ways to talk about what an abridgment is than just say on the title page, abridgment or epitome, right? So here you see the vast number of abridgments. If you run out to the store right now and go buy volume 5 of the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, I say completely disinterestedly, and look at the chapter on bibliometric analysis, you will see that this profile here of the abridgments bears a remarkably close correspondence to the productive output of the century itself. In other words, the proportions stay very alarmingly closely the same, almost to the degree that it looks like I cooked the books, which I haven't. And this is part of an ongoing study. This is work in progress. You saw it here first. So if we look by title at some of the most important abridgments here, you see Robinson Crusoe is a complete outlier, but then you start to see these are just abridgments. And I won't read it to you. You can read, for which you should thank a teacher every day. But you see that overwhelmingly religious books are highly abridged among the bestsellers of abridged books, but also Voyages as well, dictionaries, and so on. So here is a breakdown by genre. As I say, these results are preliminary, but you can see the profound abridgment of religious books, fiction, and historical books, okay? So that just gives you a little bit of the lay of the land and gives a little evidence to my argument for this ubiquity of abridgments in the 18th century. Why? Remarkably, because the Lord Chancellor himself in Giles V Wilcox in 1741 ruled that a thoughtful abridgment is protected by law. That is to say, if I take Mark Dimination's immortal book that you will all have read, Beach Blanket Bibliography, I know you know this classical text, and if I take Beach Blanket Bibliography and merely reprint the first 200 pages, that is not a thoughtful abridgment, and that is actionable. There can be an injunction issued right away prohibiting the vending of that product. But if I make what's called in the law a judicious or thoughtful abridgment, and I actually go through and make careful selection and epitome, as it were, of what Mark has written, then mirabile dictu, very foreign to our modern sensibility, that is protected under the law according to no less an authority than the Lord Chancellor himself. This is a remarkable thing. And this legal doctrine helps to explain why the reprint trade is the trade in the abridgments. Boswell said to Johnson, "This is ridiculous. This is like taking the ears or the horns and the tail off a cow and calling it a new thing and trying to sell it as a new cow." And Johnson says, "Nonsense, Boswell. It's like making the cow have a calf." So you will remember that the Act for the Encouragement of Learning is about the preservation of good copies in order to help the public be informed and learned. And so Lord Chief Justice, Lord Chancellor Hardwicke rules that the judicious abridgment is protected under law because he sees it as being commensurate with the Act of Queen Anne because it's in the public interest. It's an act not merely for profit, but for the public good. And then when the booksellers come back at this again and you have Bell versus Walker and Debrett, again in 1785, the Master of the Rolls, writing the opinion for the Lord Chancellor, again reinforces the idea, remarkably, that a thoughtful abridgment is non-injunctionable. This is a remarkable thing, and so it's protected under law. So it's all very well for us to say, ha, I've read Tom Jones. I know how long that book is. Look at this thin little volume. This isn't Tom Jones. But here's the question. What does the presence of this book, printed and reprinted in the market, do to our understanding of the reception history of Fielding and of this novel? It's no good for us to get on our high horses and to say, well, that just isn't Tom Jones. If more people read Tom Jones in Abridgements, or if more people certainly read Robinson Crusoe in Abridgements, then what's the real McCoy? Do you see? So bibliography is now confounding our sense of the reception history that we thought we knew all too well. So here we have the history of Sir Charles Grandison in 178 duodecimo pages. This is absurd in some ways, but if you've read Sir Charles Grandison, you are grateful. I am deeply grateful for the abridgment. And it's all very well for us to say, oh, but this isn't Richardson. Well, in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. It's all very well for us to complain, well, epistolary is lost. Yes, epistolary is lost. But if this is what a significant portion of the population is reading, then we must countenance this as a liminal moment in the reception history of this work. And so, once again, bibliographical history, judiciously done, informs and reinforms the conduct of literary history. Here is a book that I discovered was on the cart for our class on the book in the 18th century. You see in the middle, this is a Library of Congress book. Sterne is dead by the time this book comes out. This is a Dublin reprint of Tristram Shandy, which, as many of you will know, is a best-selling book in 9 volumes. And this is the whole of Tristram Shandy in 3 small octavo volumes. Why? Not only because it's cheaper, but please understand, if I'm a bookseller, even in Dublin where I can't be touched by the idea of the laws of piracy, it's an extremely risky undertaking for me to produce 9 volumes of Laurence Sterne, even though I already know he's a bestseller, because that's a lot of paper. That's a lot of typesetting, right? And that's a big investment on the part of the audience. But if I can commission someone to abridge Tristram Shandy into a limited number of sheets, then my abridgment can be calibrated to the capital risk that I can afford and my judgment of the carrying capacity of my local market. So now all of a sudden, I'm not imprisoned by Sterne's prolixity. I can do what I want to do and say, well, this is about as many sheets as I could handle in terms of the capital expenditure at this edition size. And so I can calculate in advance how long I want the abridgment to be, and then when I commission John to do the abridgment, it has to come in at a certain number of sheets, or indeed a certain word count, or if I'm the printer, I think about it in terms of a certain number of M's perhaps. And now all of a sudden I've ameliorated my capital risk, and I've been able to make a locally informed judgment about my resources and the carrying capacity of the market. And so all of a sudden, if we start to study abridgments in these ways, we can give a local habitation and a name. That's an original phrase that I just thought up. We can give a local habitation and a name to the carrying capacity of particular markets at particular moments in history, because we can see how many sheets the different abridgments are. They could be as long or as short as the bookseller wants them to be. They're not at the mercy of anybody. This is another Library of Congress book. This is Clarissa. This is Hartford, Connecticut. And here, this book is 138 pages, which is remarkable. Clarissa, as you remember, is a book 8 volumes and 7. Clarissa costs those 3 shillings times 7. Last time I checked, 3 times 7 is 21. And last time I checked, 21 shillings is a guinea. A guinea is a boatload of money, right? Hartford, Connecticut isn't going to pay the equivalent of a guinea for 8 volumes of Clarissa, and no local bookseller can bear that capital risk. And the productive capacity of his press just can't handle that. So what does he do? He makes Clarissa into 138 pages because that's what the market will bear, and that's what his capital expenditure can do. So all these books are therefore bespoke, and because they're bespoke in a different way than when Henry Fielding goes to Andrew Miller and says, here, I had a bestseller in Tom Jones, and now I'm giving you Amelia, and this is what it is. Now, the thing that Miller has control over is the edition quantity, which in the case of Amelia he got wrong. And it took him 10 years to sell out the edition quantity he printed because Tom Jones had to be so often reprinted. But nevertheless, Miller's at the mercy of what the author brings to him. In this case, that's not so at all. And so these books allow us to undertake certain diagnostics of the local and the provincial trade that we could never conduct in other ways before. So here's Oliver Goldsmith, who made a fortune abridging. He got $500 for producing the History of England in 2 volumes, which is just an abridgment of 4 antecedent works and combining them. And then, of course, he abridges the abridgment. We know we have his surviving agreement for his abridgment of the Roman history, for which he got £52 and 10 shillings. This is remarkable. So abridging is good work. And the reason why abridging is good work for Goldsmith is because he's a celebrity by this juncture, and his name on the title page authorizes what's been done to the text. And this is really important, and Tom Davies is willing to pay him that kind of money up front and more if it runs, precisely because the world of abridgments, the market is always stratified. And so the world of abridgments is going to hit the stratified market at a place that's new territory for that book, and Davies wants to get in on it. So what kind of books are abridged? Well, the world of Voyages is extremely popular in England, and so you see this consortium of booksellers, the Dodsleys, Rivington, Fletcher, Johnson, Strawn, and Jeffries, come out with this compendium of Voyages in 7 volumes. And in the preface they say, gosh, there's so many collections of Voyages, but you know, they're full of dross, and we're doing you a great favor by taking out the technicalities of navigation and all the boring bits, and we'll just give you the best parts. And besides, who could afford all those books? Those big folios, those large quartos. But here, these are companionable volumes, and we are doing, oh yes, a tremendous service to the public because we are letting you have the best of the best at a price you can afford, gentle reader. And so Tobias Smollett is one of the principal abridgers on this project. Thank you very much. And this runs to a second edition. What kind of books get abridged? Oh, Fox's Book of Martyrs gets abridged over and over and over again. Fox's Book of Martyrs, of course, under Fox gets bigger and bigger and bigger. In the 18th century, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller to some degree. I can tell you neither of these editions of Fox, 1760, which is really 61, and then again 66, neither of these editions of Fox tell you they're an abridgment anywhere. They just say, hi, here's Fox. And I can also tell you, because I was able to check the sheets in the Bodleian Library, these are indeed two completely different printings. And so that's interesting to know that the market will bear that. So Johnson's Dictionary, 1755, we all know that the English were so proud because it only takes one Englishman to do what the entire French Academy could not accomplish. And so that's wonderful. And of course, that's 2 volumes folio, a massive work, 1,500 copies printed. And in Johnson's lifetime, in the 29 years from when the first edition of the dictionary comes out until Johnson's death in 1784, hey, 5,000 copies of those 4 editions of the folio come out, and that's pretty great. Only somewhere between 35,000 copies and 40,000 copies of the 8vo abridgment made by Johnson himself in service of the common reader sell. So now, what's Johnson's dictionary? And how would you know? If we're asking about the dictionary as monument, it's those twin pillars of lexicography, the folios. If we're asking how did Johnson's much vaunted common reader employ the dictionary, it's got to be the 8vos, yeah? But this is a way of conducting literary history and reception history that is heretofore very little practiced because we haven't yet done the bibliographical homework in a thoroughgoing way. Bibliography and book history is meant to make us more knowing so that we can do history more authentically. And here is one of a number of examples. Of course, the abridger himself is repeatedly abridged. Here are the first 20-some-odd lives of the poets, all compassed into roughly 100 pages in, yes, an abridgment of Johnson's lives. It's also true that abridgments will come out when you want to limit your capital risk, but when you also want to capitalize on a dormant capital resource. So here we have the Micrographia, and the plates to the Micrographia still exist, Hooke's original plates. And so what are they going to do? Well, Micrographia restaurata, of course. So we're going to, use the plates and turn them into an active capital resource instead of a dormant capital resource. We're going to reprint all the plates, but note the rhetoric of the abridgment. This renders the present volume so small, though it really contains the whole sense of all that is necessary fully to understand the following plates. In fact, it's even better because we will take what was abstruse and make it clear, dear reader. This is cheaper, better, stronger, faster. You would think this was American. So this is very typical. Take a capital resource and repurpose it, but repurpose it in such a way that you're not risking too much. So here you see the famous plate that everybody knows. And then there's this chap named George Kearsley. And if we want to understand the culture of abridgments, we also need to understand the culture of excerpting, which is rampant in the 18th century. The culture of publishing beauties, the culture of publishing elegant extracts, the culture of publishing the famous Sprouter books, which are meant to be books to teach people oratory and rhetoric, but really are read as books of the beauties or excerpts of the major poets and playwrights of the time. And here is the beauties of Laurence Sterne for half a crown, 2 shillings and 6pence. Thank you very much. And I, George Kearsley, will just happen to remind you that this book is not related to, but maybe occasioned by the fact that Sterne's works have just come out in 10 volumes at the outrageous price of 2 guineas. So here you can either pay half a crown or 2 guineas. What are you going to do? A guinea is 21 shillings. So 42 shillings or 2 shillings and 6pence. What do you want to do? What's in your wallet? So it turns out that Kearsley has this interesting habit. This is from the Bodleian Library, and he engineers the 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition to come one every month, but it's all the same sheets. He changes the title page in the early preliminaries so you can't tell, but if you line them up and fingerprint the sheets, as I have been deeply privileged to do in Bodley, what do you discover? You discover that those sheets, the inner form and the outer form of every sheet is exactly identical. Thank you very much. And what's he trying to do? He's trying to get momentum for the book. He's trying to make the book a fashionable commodity. So here is a book that's bibliographically fascinating, something of a puzzle to me. This is a translation into French of Tom Jones. Now, in my view, and I haven't finished my study yet, this is going to take me several years, but in my view, almost every translation from English into French is an abridgment, and almost every translation from French into English is an abridgment. And partly because if you're reading it in another language, how would you know that what was being abridged? And again, this is an opportunity for the bookseller to calibrate how big he wants the book to be. In this case, 3 volumes bound into 1, 3 volumes duodecimo. So this is an abridgment, trust me. It's also a false imprint. It's not published in London, and it's using a London bookseller's name, but the London bookseller has nothing to do with this book. And the thing that I haven't been able to determine, if there are any experts out there, I'd be grateful for the help of the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm having difficulty telling if the paper is Swiss, which would lead me to believe that it was printed at the STN, the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, or if the paper is French, in which case I believe it's most likely printed in Lyon. So paper moves back and forth a lot, and it's a little bit hard to tell. But the idea is this ain't what it seems. It looks complete to those who don't know, but it's not. It's an abridgment. So, as you will know, the 3 voyages of Cook are signal moments in the history of human exploration. And as you will know, Cook tragically dies on the shore of Hawaii and in the 3rd voyage. And when the crew comes back, they're desperate to have the official account. And when the official account is published one fine June day in 3 volumes, large quarto, with the volume underneath that you can see the atlas volume, because there's so many cuts, so many engravings, the charts of navigation and so on. These 3 volumes go for 4.5 guineas. The press run is 2000. In the mid-afternoon of the third day of sale in June of 1784, they sell the last copy and begin printing the second edition. Do you think this was a fashionable commodity? Do you think that the upper classes had to have this book? Well, no less, the middling sort had to have the book too. And immediately there follows the first of a whole series of abridgments of the third voyage of Captain Cook. This one published in 4 volumes, each volume comprising 6 parts. 24 parts in all. They make no bones about the fact that it's an abridgment, as you can see, and you can follow the progress of this along merely by looking at the direction line, which will tell you in an unabashed way exactly where they are in the progress of this coming out in parts. Will it surprise anyone by this juncture to note that they had the subscribers all lined up and already paying in advance? No. So the reason why this is issued in parts is because the first part can be printed the first day of sale and be available by the second day, and they can begin to satisfy all the subscribers by the end of the week, because it's only one fascicle in the 6x4 set of fascicles that they're going to use for the whole thing. This is ingenious. Many of you will never have heard of a bookseller named George Kearsley, who we saw earlier with the Beauties of Johnson. Here you see it's an unabashed abridgment. Right there it says the first word, an abridgment of Captain Cook's last voyage, and the plate of the death of Cook right in the frontispiece, the portal into the sensational story. And Kearsley publishes his abridgment for 4 shillings. That's the second one. And here, note the rhetoric of the abridgment here. It is an undoubted fact that not one person in 50 can, with convenience or propriety, make the purchase, however eager the curiosity pursue it. But we will accommodate you, gentle reader. We will help you. We will make this available to you. It will be better, faster, stronger. You get the idea. It's the same rhetoric as you're getting when Ortelius is abridged and those 3 maps, the star map and Formosa and the other map, are added, right? This is the same idea. Somehow this is smaller, but somehow this is bigger, right? Because we're giving you what you most want. Then the third abridgment comes out, and I want you to understand there are 49 plates in this abridgment and 2 maps. This is not a cheap print production. I mean, it's relatively cheap compared to paying 4.5 guineas, but this is not the low end of the market. The low end of the market is yet to be exploited, and I won't iterate every abridgment of Cook. But this too is a highly desirable production and raises for us the question, I believe, what does it mean to read an abridgment in the 18th century? What does it mean to undertake an abridgment? It seems not at all to be an occasion of shame either to consume these things or to produce these things. Rather, it seems that this is part and parcel of the ordinary operation of the marketplace, and yet an aspect of the operation of the marketplace that we have again and again missed for a variety of reasons, some of which I've tried to delineate here. So then, in my view, the history of the abridgments of Cook's third voyage becomes still more interesting when we look at their reprinting in America and in other provincial markets. So here we see those 3 volumes in large octavo become 9.5 sheets in duodecimo in Isaiah Thomas's Worcester. Very, very interesting because of the bespoke nature of what an abridgment is and his measure of the carrying capacity of his market. Or here we see in Philadelphia an 18mo production in just 7 sheets. This is remarkable to me. A city like Philadelphia is going to deliver Cook in such a truncated way. Why? Because they can, and because he limits his capital risk. Or even here, this more extensive rendering of Cook here in Boston, the whole thing, the 3 voyages in just 2 volumes duodecimo, right? So here are all the best bits. It's not the Cliff's Notes. This is Cook's Voyages. But it's Cook's Voyages in a way that you can afford, and it's Cook's Voyages in a way that the undertaker can afford to deliver to market. So it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the presence of these abridgments in the market need to occasion in us a rethinking of how we conduct literary history, and ought to, I think, in us revive our sense of how essential bibliography and book history can be to understanding the reception history of books. A caution. You cannot get most of this information out of catalogs. There is no substitute for the haptic knowledge of holding the book in your hand and examining it with your own eyes. Oftentimes, the abridgments are not cataloged as such. And so you need to really look at the books. And if you really want to understand how they're made, and above all, what their production values actually are, you need to look at a lot of books. Graham Pollard famously said, "You know nothing about books until you have examined with your own hands and your own eyes 5,000 hand-pressed books." So we need to restore, as librarians, as scholars, as curators, as conservators, we need to restore a sense of the essential nature of the haptic knowledge of books as cultural objects that can teach us again and again that our old certainties are false, that our old pictures of the market and of the way things were read and understood are at best partial. As Mr. Shelley teaches us, we must learn to imagine what we know. Thank you very much indeed. I'd be very happy to take questions. Please. The law does change at some point, because if you try to make an abridgment, they're going to throw you in jail if it's not authorized, right? So copyright law changes a great deal in the 19th century, but for the 18th century, this is the practice. Now, it is true that the stationer's company does have ways of trying to marginalize you if you operate outside of the mores and taboos of the guild. But it's also true that there are lots of people, especially the provincial booksellers and the booksellers abroad, who make abridgments all the time. Scotland, Dublin, America, and indeed, once you get outside the home counties, there are none of these there are no prosecutions for this.
My sister had a copy of Little Women that I grew up reading, and it wasn't until I was reading it to my daughter that I realized that what she had was an abridged edition, and I have no memory of it saying anywhere on it that it was abridged.
It probably...
in the 20th century.
Sure. And so this abridged edition of Little Women that doesn't even call attention to itself as an abridgment is produced in part for the very same reasons that as it were, my booksellers were producing these abridged editions, because they're cheaper, because the capital risk is delimited, and because they're less intimidating. There seem to be friendlier books, down format, smaller, less an investment of your money and time. And so why wouldn't you do that? Yeah, please.
Yet another example of the perils of clinging to the idea, the platonic idea of the ideal copy. You've sounded this note of caution before, that we must attend to the production circumstances and the phenomena before us if we are to create a compelling literary history linked to the book histories that you've been showing us how to be attentive to. So thank you for that. My question is this: we're well into the era of solid, thumping, vital review journals. Are there any reviews that warn the reader, don't spend your money on this abridgment, but instead hold out for that abridgment? Or are there any notes of caution? If you buy this abridgment, you won't get the salacious bits that were really fun in the original one. And that there must be some kind of culture of response to these that would be interesting to try to examine.
Lorna, it's a great question, so let me just repeat the gist of it. Obviously, the whole thrust of this argument is somehow anti-Platonist, because there's no sort of perfect version of Robinson Crusoe or Moll Flanders in the sky, but rather we need to look at what was actually happening on the ground and how people were reading their books. Dare I say, we need to do the history of reading in part from the material objects themselves. Reading is conditioned, of course, by social practices, and I would never be a material determinist. But surely we need to understand reading practices as highly conditioned by that beautiful and complex equation between materialities and the making of culturally instantiated meanings. And so we need to look at what's actually happening, and therefore Dr. Clymer asks the question, is it not the case that there's some evidence of the reception of these and some kind of comparing? And here I feel like I often felt as a child at the school of the Holy Child Jesus, standing before the nuns and confessing, in this regard, I have not done my homework, because this project is in process and I haven't gone to the review journals, the Monthly and the Critical and the Edinburgh, to look for these data points. So they may be out there and they may not be out there. I don't know the answer, but it's extremely salutary point to make. Is there any weighing up of the abridgments of Cook to say, oh, the Kearsley is rubbish, but this other one is really good and you'll get much better value for your money? I would hope so, but I don't know. John?
I have a sort of related question, Michael. How much corroborating evidence have you come up with thus far for your assertion regarding the contemporary attitudes about abridgments? If I'm reading your argument correctly, and I may have missed something, the argument is running, there were a whole heck of a lot of them, and respected people were doing them, and therefore attitudes toward them were positive. But the same could be said for, and I may be wrong misreading you, but the same could be said for study guides today. We have the learned Harold Bloom writing the learned version of Cliff's Notes, just as we, and there are vast numbers of four separate editions of the Cliff's Notes for Jane Eyre alone, and 4 of the Monarch Notes, and the Spark Notes, and the Let's Literature Guide, and everything else. Is this a 20th century attitude? Is this an 18th century attitude? And is it in fact different?
It's a good question. I would say that Harold Bloom engages in this activity because he has a disabled son, a developmentally disabled son who's going to be in an institution for the rest of his life, and this is how Bloom intends to make sure that his son never lacks the support that he requires. I think Bloom is in some ways an outlier in doing this. I think most of the people who write the Cliff Notes are impoverished postdocs or graduate students. I'm sorry. But it's also true that I have been looking for derisory remarks about these abridgments. And of course, the original publishing booksellers don't like them. Except for when they themselves commission the abridgments, as in that marvelous consortium of the princes of publishing in the middle of the 18th century, Miller, Dodsley, Kearsley, and so on, all who own shares in the dictionary, and they know exactly what to do, and they know exactly who their man is, and exactly how to do it. So I think an abridgment is a really great thing when you're going to make money from it, and an abridgment is not a really good thing when somebody's going to make money from what you have originally published. And I think it's as simple as that. I think that we're a bit idealistic and naive when we think about what somebody like Robert Dodsley, how he may have thought about his business undertakings. His principal goal, mirabile dictu, is to make money. And sure, he understands that he's going to occupy a certain stratum in the market, but within certain behaviors that are forbidden, he's going to do just about all he can to leverage his advantage, both against his fellow booksellers and to activate the consumer habits of the public. And so I have not found any derisory comments from either authors or booksellers about the world of abridgments. And I think in many ways it's akin to saying, hey, my article got syndicated, or, hey, this thing is reprinted in another venue, and that's terrific, and more people will get to see it. So for the most part, I haven't been able to find that sort of material, though I've certainly been looking for it. And Goldsmith, who drinks a lot and gambles a lot, does not in any way seem to do this out of desperation, for the most part, right? We know that Johnson appears at Goldsmith's door and brings the money to his creditors because the bailiffs are pacing up and down in front of his door. So maybe Goldsmith isn't the best example, but Smollett is not in penury of any kind when he's undertaking these abridgments, to the best of my knowledge. Johnson could have commissioned the abridgment of the dictionary to someone else very easily, but he does not. So I think it's important to say, people were undertaking these abridgments because they were successful. The abridgers were making money, the booksellers were making money, the publishing, the other sellers of the abridgments were making money. This seems to me like win-win-win all around, but not part of the collecting practice of individuals or cultural institutions, inordinately low survival rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this, to me, is why, how can I say, oh, well, this has always been here, but we just haven't noticed? Well, I think because of a concatenation of a variety of reasons, some of which are about the survival of material traces, and some of which are about the nature of the cultural products that are projects that our forebears have undertaken.
In the 19th century in America, you read that people were ecstatic, thinking about the arrival of a new Scott novel from England. Would this have been abridged or stolen from Scott?
Well, there's a very interesting question. So the question is, people, we know, for instance, let's shift from Scott to Dickens just for a moment, right? We know, for instance, that people were waiting on the dockside of New York, right, to see what happened to Little Nell, right? We know that the police were worried. There were so many people on the dock waiting for the ship to come in so that someone could, break open the package and read the passage. And I won't spoil what happens to Little Nell in case you don't know, but many unhappy people left the dock that day. Men were weeping. But Dickens, of course, undertakes his reading tour precisely because he is furious that the American booksellers are making so much money off his wit and imagination and wordcraft, and he's making nothing. So he says, damn it, I'm going to undertake a reading tour because I have this popularity and I am going to find a way to capitalize on it because all the booksellers who are publishing my works are pirates. And even Conan Doyle, for instance, quite a bit later, Conan Doyle comes to America to undertake his reading tour and his lecturing tour for the very same reason. The way that the American copyright law is written at that juncture is that international copyright obtains if the book is published first in America. And of course, that's not what happens most of the time, and therefore these books are not protected in the United States, and therefore authors find other expedients in order to try to capitalize on their popularity.
So I have a version of Dr. Carson's question, which is that would you be willing to speculate about how the culture of abridgment sort of affects, say, the novel? I mean, is there any kind of normal response to this culture of abridgment in the production of creative writing or anything of that nature? Does that make sense?
So the question is, well, if these abridgments, if I paraphrase, if these abridgments are so darn ubiquitous, Michael, then surely there must be some reflexivity that they must affect the cultural production of novels. Perhaps. On the other hand, we need to remember that, for instance, when George Eliot publishes Middlemarch in those 8 parts, she has an incentive for prolixity. I think Middlemarch is the greatest novel ever published in the English language. Others may disagree, maybe, but she has a reason to make it be in 8 parts. That's what her contract says. Dickens, needs to get to that 19th and 20th part, right? Thackeray, there's a reason why Vanity Fair is as long as it is, or Pendennis, or the Virginians, or even the History of Henry Esmond, for Pete's sake. So it seems to me that there are 2 contrary market forces at work, and I think that the bird in the hand is worth a lot more than 2 in the bush in this instance. So I personally, again, I've only been working on this for about 3 years, and I think this requires quite a sustained study. I'd like to assure you it's not the only thing I ever plan to do with the rest of my life, but at the same time, I do believe that this requires further study, and the question of how it translates into 19th century practice, I leave to my betters, many of whom are sitting in this audience. Please.
Is it correct to assume that because the abridgments were catering to a lower market, that the paper and the typesetting and the printing quality would also be of lesser quality, so you might be able to identify them that way if they're not actually
is it correct to assume that because these are less expensive print products and occupy a different stratum in the marketplace, that the production values are inferior to the original production values? Is that a fair paraphrase? No. Not at all. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted in particular to show you that third abridgment of Cook's Final Voyage, because with 49 charts and 2 cuts in the book, this is a remarkable, high value production. It is true that some of them are on lesser paper, which is, most of the cost of producing the book, but by no means all. I would say that the Tom Jones, for instance, that I showed you, now it happens to be a very nice copy in the Houghton Library, and the binding is in some ways risible. It's a collector's binding. Very rare thing to find an abridgment in a collector's binding, speaking to the point we were addressing earlier. But no, I find that for the most part, the production values are quite high, with some notable exceptions. And I would say, too, it would be injudicious of us to compare printing in Hartford, Connecticut to printing in London at the same time, because the resources just aren't the same, right? So we need to be a little bit careful about comparing apples to apples and not comparing apples to oranges. I think if we were to sort of say, well, how are we going to evaluate that Hartford, Connecticut production, we'd need to compare it to original publications that were also part of provincial presses in New England, and we would see that indeed this one is as good as anything that's coming off those presses. So again, I think that these are, of course, price points, but they're certainly theories about the market. And I think that to make the books unattractive is with a few exceptions. I mean, we saw that those halfpenny half-sheet epitomes of Ure Divino are nasty productions, right? The paper is bad. Of course, the paper trade in England is bad at the time, but the paper is bad. The presswork isn't particularly good. The woodcut on the cover is stolen. It's reversed from the second edition of True-Born Englishmen, and so on. So it's not always the case. There are times when, but I think that in the case of the Ure Divino, it's because of speed. It's not it's not merely because of price point. It's because speed is of the essence at that moment in getting the product to market. And that's, you can make it good, and you can make it fast, and you can make it cheap. But you can't make it all three, right? You have to choose. You can make it good and fast, but it's not cheap, right? You can make it cheap and good, but then it's not going to be fast, and so on. So you have this triangle of value, and you can only ever have two of them at the same time. And to me, that's a very useful heuristic for thinking about the book trade more generally. Please.
You talk about
And then Steve. Go ahead.
You talk about the value of speed in creating a book. Did booksellers or writers ever publish their own abridgments, or were abridgments something that was sort of swooped into someone else and see something popular and then go for it?
It's interesting. Well, certainly Goldsmith abridges his own abridgments. Johnson abridges his own writings. But by and large, it's a good question. By and large, as far as I know, not. Now, one of the issues is I've been searching mostly in the manuscripts division of the British Library for the agreements for undertaking abridgments. As you might imagine, they're not well calendared, and they're hard to find. But for the most part, We don't see authors undertaking abridgments of their own works. Let's take, for instance, in works of science, because they say, well, I'm trying to do work. Or in the case of novelists, because these abridgments, generally speaking, are meant to be of sure bets. It's the reprint trade, and they're undertaking the possibility of writing a new novel or a new play, for which the income they would receive is much greater than for undertaking the abridgment. So again, I think this is a marketplace, and we haven't figured abridgments as part of the marketplace, either in authorship or in the book-selling world or in the consumption of cultural goods. And I do think that the more we countenance this, the more we'll know, and we'll get a fuller, thicker picture of what's actually happening in the culture. Let's have the final question. You need to eat.
Did it work the other way? Would an American author expect to see his novel abridged when it was published in England if he was lucky enough to see that happen?
Well, in the 19th century, of course, the only novel that's published for a long time by an American printer is when Ben Franklin produces his edition of Clarissa, and that goes of Pamela. And that goes so badly that it's more than 30 years before a new novel is printed in the United States, as it were. So for the most part, those longer print productions are produced in England anyway, and so then they become part of the ecosystem in a normal way. I have kept you a long time. I'm very grateful for your attentiveness. I would be glad to answer questions for those of you who still have remaining questions or comments or indeed excoriations. And I thank you very much for coming this evening.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.